Israeli allies were denied oil exports by Arab oil producers in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. However, in response to Israel's current assault on Gaza, Gulf powers reject the notion of employing the oil weapon, a sign of how deeply they have turned their backs on the Palestinian cause. Khalid al-Faleh, the Saudi Minister of Investments, made an appearance at Bloomberg's New Economy Forum in Singapore on November 8. He was questioned by Stephanie Flanders, the senior economics editor of the network, regarding potential Saudi reactions to the Middle East conflict. Would you think about using economic instruments, like the price of oil, to bring about a truce in Gaza? Histically laughs. To begin with, it is not my directive for today. Phew, for the two of us only. I can confirm that's not on the agenda for today. Saudi Arabia is attempting to achieve peace via dialogue. By the time this interaction occurred, Israel had been hitting Gaza's civilian population randomly for a whole month in retaliation for the October 7 onslaught led by Hamas, with help from the U.S. and several major European nations. Given the backdrop of a conflict that has captured the interest of the world's media and resulted in almost 10,000 civilian Palestinian deaths to date, Flanders' inquiry made perfect sense. Considering the historical precedents of using the oil supply as a political weapon, it also made logical. Why, therefore, did her question make people laugh? The British journalist mentioned an incident that happened exactly 50 years ago. 13 years after its founding in 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, possessed and regulated the majority of global oil commerce and production. The Gulf states were the epicenter of oil and gas extraction at the time. Therefore, its Arab members held the lion's share of authority when it came to setting output and pricing. In the midst of the cold conflict, Anwar el-Sadat's Egypt and Hafez al-Assad's Syria began an offensive on October 6 of that year to reclaim portions of their territories, especially the Golan Heights and Sinai, which Israel had captured during the June 1967 conflict. The Arab OPEC countries, particularly Saudi Arabia under King Faisal, placed an embargo on crude oil supplies to the U.S. and its allies as payback for President Richard Nixon's decision to back Israel in its conflict with the Palestinians and Arabs. On October 17, 1973, Arab members of OPEC met in Kuwait and resolved to halt oil exports to Western countries and cut output by 5% each month until the Israelis left the seized Arab areas. The cost of an oil barrel increased fourfold. The first oil shock caused significant losses for Western economies. The rise in the price of imported oil had a disastrous impact on the U.S. economy as a whole. The American Treasury Department estimates that the GNP decreased by between $10 and $20 billion, and that in just 6 months, 500,000 people lost their employment. The same department also pointed out that the U.S. balance of payments was severely damaged by the OPEC embargo, which increased the country's overall oil bill. In France, the oil bill could be paid with 10% of export earnings in 1970. By 1974, however, this amount had increased to 24%. The OPEC embargo caused long-lasting economic harm in the U.S. and other countries even after it was removed in March 1974. The OPEC embargo caused long-lasting economic harm in the U.S. and other countries even after it was removed in March 1974. It appears that the October 1973 Arab-Israeli War and the Gaza War of 2023 are not the same. This latest conflict is incredibly asymmetrical, pitting one of the most powerful and well-equipped militaries in the world against the weapons that Hamas resistance can gather. In contrast to the previous, which paired two normal armies against an occupying army with significant allies supporting each side. The Arab oil nations sided with the Arab camp during the initial fighting. The civilian population of Gaza, which numbered 2.3 million prior to the Israeli murderous invasion, is left to fend for themselves in the ongoing conflict while bombarding homes, mosques, churches, hospitals, and United Nations schools with indiscriminate bombs. The world changed in the 50 years that separated these two wars. There were truces in wars, invasions, and retreats, peace treaties, agreements to normalize relations, economic penalties, the fall of some international powers, and the emergence of others. The Gulf has also undergone changes. What then are these changes, and how do they stop the Gulf Arabs from using their hydrocarbons to protect the Gazan Arabs from the ceaseless murders by the Zionists? The new global oil axis is East-East. According to Adam Haney's explanation in his contribution to the collaborative book Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region, Pluto, 2023, the first change happened at the level of the oil market itself. Haney's chronology traces the history of oil from its inception, but his research identifies three key phases. During the 1970s and 1980s, there was a nationalization wave that gave Gulf governments the ability to directly oversee upstream production. This resulted in national oil companies like Saudi Aramco, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and Kuwait Petroleum Corporation handling the exploration, extraction, and export of the region's oil supplies. With China's opening to the global economy and subsequent posture at the forefront of global manufacturing, the second pivotal stage commenced in the late 1990s. China's status as the workshop of the world was confirmed during the third phase, which began in the 2010s. Approximately 45% of global oil exports in 2019 went to Asia, with China accounting for almost half of these shipments. The Middle East is the source of the majority of these oil supplies, with the Gulf states and Iraq together providing nearly half of China's oil imports by 2020, up from approximately one-third in 2001, Haney notes, highlighting the fact that this is a pan-Asian trend and that roughly 70% of all Middle Eastern crude oil exports, mainly from the Gulf, are currently headed for Asia. After being rocked by the 1973 oil crisis, the United States has recovered to become the world's largest oil producer. The Americans painstakingly sought the Gulf of Mexico, the North Sea, and Alaska for fresh oil sources because they harbor a bitter memory of the Texas oil reserves that failed to make up the difference 50 years before. Additionally, Washington has made every effort to erode OPEC's hold on the oil market by undermining some of its most notable members such as Iraq, Iran, Libya, and Venezuela, through wars and sanctions. Additionally, Washington has undermined several of OPEC's most notable members through wars and sanctions in an effort to undercut the organization's hold on the oil market. The largest OPEC petroleum exporter to the U.S., Saudi Arabia, accounted for 7% of all U.S. petroleum imports and 7% of all U.S. crude oil imports in 2022, according to a recent report by the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Since 1977, the percentage shares of U.S. total petroleum and crude oil imports from OPEC countries have generally declined. The majority of U.S. petroleum imports from Persian Gulf nations come from Saudi Arabia. Canada accounted for almost 52% of all U.S. petroleum imports. The oil weapon may be worthless against Washington, but it might have convinced a few European nations to stop blindly supporting Israeli atrocities in Gaza and the West Bank. Since the start of the conflict in Ukraine in February 2022 and the prohibition on the seaborne import of Russian gas and crude oil, the European Union (EU) has found itself without a consistent source of energy. In terms of percentage of trade in value, EU imports of crude oil from Saudi Arabia increased from 6.3% to 8.8% in the second quarter of 2022 and 2023, according to data from Eurostat. During that time, Algeria's proportion of gas imports into the EU rose from 7.2% to 16.5% of trade in value, while Russia's share decreased. Major Arab OPEC members Saudi Arabia and Algeria both have the potential to influence the composition of the EU's energy supply chain as well as its foreign policy towards Israel and Palestine. The second reason the Saudi minister might have chuckled is that Riyadh's former enemy, Israel, is now one of its allies. Although Saudi King Faisal expressed his distaste for Zionism, today's Gulf state political and bureaucratic elites view Israel as a strategic partner with whom they may have cordial meetings and share words of appreciation. In 2020, Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right Zionist government signed the so-called Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, following peace accords with Egypt and Jordan in 1978 and 1994, respectively. The Abraham Accords are a set of normalization agreements mediated by the United States that also aim to strengthen pre-existing normalization relations with other Arab nations not included in the agreement, such as Jordan and Egypt, formal diplomatic ties with Israel and Saudi Arabia and Oman, which have not yet formalized their long-standing relations with Israel. Gulf governments assert that their support for the Palestinians is not being discontinued. Before the deal was signed on September 15, 2020 in Washington, the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates clarified that, with this agreement, we will be able to support the Palestinian people in their aspirations for an independent state within a rich and stable region. This deal is an expansion of earlier peace accords that Arab countries have signed with the State of Israel. All of these agreements seek to promote stability and sustained growth. However, in contrast to what the Emirati minister asserts, more persecution against the Palestinian people has resulted from the Abraham Accords and other eco-normalization programs that facilitate agreements with Israel on water and electricity. In her chapter on eco-normalization and dismantling green colonialism, Palestinian scholar Manal Shkar examines the effects that such ongoing Arab-Israeli projects have on Palestinians, including those in the occupied West Bank, Gaza Strip, annexed Syrian Golan Heights, and even the 1948 colonized Palestinian territories, where harsh apartheid is still practiced. No matter what forms the energy projects in the Mediterranean and Israel take, according to Shkar, two important facts will always exist. Firstly, she draws a connection between the highly militarized gas reservoirs Israel controls in the Mediterranean and the projects associated with them, where Gulf petrodollars are a major asset, and the violence and dehumanization suffered by Palestinian fishermen and besieged people in Gaza. Second, she contends that the EU is once again demonstrating its hypocrisy by openly portraying Palestinian and Jalani, Golan Heights, peoples as less human than Ukrainians while importing Israeli gas in an attempt to blame Russia responsible for its invasion of Ukraine. The normalizer Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Morocco, are now openly taking part in the systematic dehumanization of Palestinians and Syrians at the hands of both Zionists and European governments, according to Shkar, because of their agreements with Israel. Therefore, the EU and Israel are greenwashing the dehumanization of the colonized and the Arab states' complicity in this, as they cooperate in what is portrayed as a transition to a greener future and lower carbon economy. Some would argue that the Saudi minister's chuckle was inoffensive. It is, however, a grim indication of the cynicism of the regimes in the Gulf and other Arab countries, which watch with complicit, cowardly, and criminal apathy as Zionists slaughter Palestinian Arabs. That's where we wrap things up for the time being. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.